Everyone who has played Schubert's music, everyone who has listened to it, has their own Schubert narrative. It's something that evolves over the years with new ideas and perceptions, discoveries. It seems that this composer belongs to each one of us individually. We know a great deal about Schubert, but we will never know enough. The gaps are filled with a host of personal theories and conjectures. This is my version of Schubert's story after more than 50 years of playing his music and reading and writing about him. This is the truth as I believe it to have been, but the skeleton of undisputed facts can be fleshed up in different ways, and others will tell the story from other points of view. The man remains for us an enigma, perhaps exactly as he intended. Early in 1816, Schubert was working in his father's school in the Säulengasse. Of course, he wasn't very happy at this work. He wanted to get out, to make money, to stand on his own 2 feet. He took a great deal of trouble to apply for a job in Laibach, the present-day Ljubljana in Slovenia. He didn't get the job, of course. Schubert never got the jobs he tried to apply for. He was singularly unsuccessful on more than one occasion. But in this instance, it's just as well he didn't leave Vienna. Well, Schubert's life, had he lived in Slovenia, would have had a completely different aspect to it, different friends, different music. We would be tracing a different history. But as it was, in staying in Vienna, he had his circle of friends. And one of the most important of these friends was a poet called Johann Baptist Mayrhofer. And this talk is called the Mayrhofer years because it embraces the period when Schubert was most influenced by this extraordinary man. Difficult, reserved, a libertarian in many of his beliefs, but he worked as an imperial book censor, exactly opposite to the type of political beliefs that he had. Schubert was introduced to Mayrhofer by Joseph von Spaun. In 1814, I think Schubert must have taken his recently composed Gretchen am Spinnrade to Mayrhofer. Mayrhofer didn't push his own poems on Schubert, but by the end of the year, Schubert had set a ballad of Mayrhofer's called Am See. In 1815 and 1816, there are some Mayrhofer songs. But essentially, what happened between these two men was a question of conversation and education, because Mayrhofer was one of the very few people who instantly realized, it seemed, that Schubert was a genius, that this was something very special. And he took very great pride in taking Schubert in hand, explaining things, giving him books to read. It was exactly the type of intellectual background that the composer lacked at home. An entry in one of Mayrhofer's diaries is very interesting. It says, "The fog of the present time will be lifted by listening to Schubert's melodies." Schubert composed no fewer than 142 solo songs in 1816. Of course, it's not quite the same amazing record as 1815, but it's still a considerable number. And of these, because this is a program essentially about Schubert and Mayrhofer, let's listen to one of the most beautiful of the early Mayrhofer settings from 1816, Lied eines Schiffers an die Dioskuren. It's a hymn based on the Roman poet Catullus, which asks for the protection. The boatman asks for the protection of Castor and Pollux, the gods, the stars in the sky who protect travelers. And for this music, Schubert finds a nobility of texture and theme exactly suited to the classical themes and ideals that will be so much part of the few following years. There were to be more significant classical songs in 1817, but that song shows the direction that Schubert and Mayrhofer were going to go. It has nobility, it has classicism, it's got an amazing calm and majesty. And I think these qualities came into Schubert's life through his connection with this poet. And it's very interesting that Mayrhofer, who trained in San Florian as a part of a seminary, had abandoned the church, had come to Vienna to study law, and had turned his back on conventional religion and instead given all his energy to the study of the classics and the way that people lived and thought in ancient times. The gift of friendship with Mayrhofer is something that Joseph von Spaun had provided. He provided Schubert with so much support throughout his life. But one of the projects that he thought was absolutely essential was for this music to be published. Spaun believed that with a little bit of the right help, Schubert could become known as a published song composer, even as early as 1816. And Spaun had the idea that he could call on the help of Goethe. If Goethe in Weimar, the great poet, the poet that Schubert had set so spectacularly well already, if Goethe would support the venture, then surely the Viennese publishers would be absolutely delighted to publish Schubert's songs. And he had a plan. He suggested 2 volumes of Goethe settings, 2 volumes of Klopstock settings, 2 volumes of the settings of Ossian, 1 volume of Schiller, and a composite volume of Mattison, Hölty, and Salasewicz. Interestingly enough, this idea of Lieder being published under poet headings, as it were, is something that would have to wait until the 1880s and 90s, when Hugo Wolf took up the idea in a big way with Mörike-Lieder, Eichendorff-Lieder, and so on. But the idea was, let's make a book of 16 songs, beautifully transcribed by Schubert, and send them in a package to Weimar. And then surely the great Goethe will be so incredibly pleased with 16 settings of his poems that are so beautiful, so good, that he will back Schubert's career. One of the songs of that 16 sent to Goethe was Der König in Thule. It's a ballad from Faust. Gretchen sings as she muses on the quality of love, the very quality of love and faithfulness shown by the king in the song, who has a goblet given to him by his beloved and keeps it to the end of his days. Well, this quality of love is exactly what Gretchen will never receive from Faust. So there is an irony. But somehow Schubert has imagined a background of medieval modal splendor and gravity, and everything that is important about the German tradition of strophic songs, one verse sung after the other without musical alteration, is here evident in this amazing song. And we have it here sung by Brigitte Fassbender.
Es war ein König in Thule, gar treu bis an das Grab, dem Sterben seine Buhle einen goldenen Becher gab. Es ging ihm nichts darüber, lehrt in jeden Schmaus, die Augen gingen ihm über, so oft trank daraus.
No one could have argued this is not a perfect strophic song. There were other songs more adventurous, but then it isn't as if Goethe's favorite composers, Reichardt and Zelter, were also not capable of doing adventurous and unusual things with this poetry. But the fact of the matter is, and I've already said that everything that Schubert applied for was unsuccessful, this beautiful volume of poems was returned without comment from Weimar and received by Schubert. It must have been a heartbreaking disappointment. A great deal of speculation has gone into why on earth that happened. Some people imagine that it's to do with the fact that Goethe didn't like the music, that he was offended by too much adventurous harmony, too much happening in music. He preferred another style. But I'm convinced that the music never reached the music stand of Goethe's piano. He couldn't play it himself. There wasn't a musician there to play it. It so happened that his beloved wife, Christiana Vulpius, was dying at exactly the time this parcel of songs arrived. He'd also had a terrible argument with Karl Eberwein, a local composer. He wasn't in the mood to be dealing with composers. But perhaps worst of all, the package came from Vienna, a town that Goethe distrusted, a town that he never visited, a town indeed that was full of false, difficult people in his mind. And then to see the name Spaun, and Franz von Spaun our wonderful Joseph von Spahn's uncle, was one of the most vocal of Goethe critics. It's not beyond possibility that simply seeing the word Spahn in the covering letter to Goethe was enough to put him off. It's one of the tragedies of music, I think, that there wasn't somebody there who could nevertheless play the music, get the great old man interested. But that was Schubert's luck. Very little of it in so many ways in his career. Many people would have been so discouraged with the return of this wonderful music, and really, this bundle of 16 songs composed world-class masterpieces, Gretchen, Erlkönig. One would have imagined that some people might have thought, well, I won't compose any more Goethe then. But such was the humility of this composer that he took the setback on the chin and went looking for further settings. We're going to hear a part of Anschwager Kronos. This poem doesn't appear in the Viennese edition of the poems that Goethe used. It makes me think that already at the stage in 1816, Mayrhofer, who was a fanatical Goethe admirer, was suggesting poems to Schubert. And this poem has a classical subject, Kronos being a metaphor for a coachman, time, Kronos driving through life at a terrible pace. And Schubert's music exactly matches the impetus of the merciless journey of time as we go from youth to old age.
Spute dich, Kronos, fort den rasselnden Trott. Bergab gleitet der Weg, bergab gleitet der Weg. Ekles Schwinden zögert mir vor die Stirne dein Zaudern. Frisch holpert es gleich über Stock und Steine den Trott, rasch ins Leben hinein, rasch ins Leben hinein. Nun schon wieder den atmenden Schritt, nun schon wieder mühsam Berg hinauf, auf den nicht trägeren, strebend und hoffend hinan. Weit, hoch, herrlich, bringst den Blick ins Leben hinein. Vom Gebirge zum Gebirge schwebet der ewige Geist, ewigen Lebens voll.
That song, sung by Sir Simon Keenlyside, is of a huge stature and grandeur. And we have to remind ourselves sometimes that we're speaking here of a 19-year-old boy. A song that made him almost as famous as Erlkönig was Der Wanderer. It caught on and people were impressed with it to an extraordinary degree. And in sheerly musical terms, one can see why. The use of recitative combined with melody, heavenly melody, melody like this. The mingling of melody and recitative is a lesson well learnt from 1816 generally. It happens in the Mattison settings. It happens in a great deal of music that Schubert wrote, right up to a work like Die Schöne Müllerin. But this complexity, this ability to be as complex as he ever wished to be, however complex the poem demanded that he should be, well, what if the poem demanded nothing else than a kind of simplicity and a direct charm? He was up to that, equally and without difficulty. Music poured from him. Here are a few songs from 1816 that show exactly how melodic he could be. First of all, Seligkeit. Now the tune. It's the most perfect Viennese waltz ever written. And it's tongue-in-cheek. The poem suggests that heaven is right here on earth as long as Lara is here smiling. But that's the salon, and that's nobility, and that's town life. But Schubert knew about country people. The country people, when they came into Vienna, probably were not far from where he lived in the Schoolhouse. There were fishermen around, there were artisans of all kinds. So it's only a leap of the imagination to a song that's right next door in the complete edition. The text is by Hölty, just as Seligkeit was, but this time it's the glory of the harvest, where the workers can be tipsy and jolly as they work with their scythes. And the wonderful singer here is the late Peter Schreier.
Sichelschallen, Ähren fallen unter Sichelschall. Auf den Mädchenhüten zittern blaue Blüten. Freud ist überall, Freud ist überall. Sicheln klingen, Mädchen singen unter Sichelklang. Bis vom Mond beschimmert, rings die Stoppel flimmert, tönt der Erntesang, tönt der Erntesang.
Harvest time in Erntelied is followed by autumn. And here's a little autumn melody to end the survey of songs of 1816, this time written in November of this year. How delightful is that? So beautiful, so pretty, so delicate that we could hear it a number of times, as indeed we do when the strophic song is performed. Schubert had failed to get that job in Laibach, but it was clear that whenever there was a chance for him to be able to leave his house, he was going to take it. At the end of December 1816, he was invited to be a sort of a semi-permanent house guest at the home of one of his school friends, Franz von Schober. The Schobers, and Franz von Schober lived with his mother and his sister, were very well-to-do. Their house was in a wonderful part of Vienna, in the Tuchlauben. There was a piano there were books, and it seems that things had got unbearable at home. We have no idea of the parental ructions that occurred, although Schober claimed many years afterwards that he had placated Schubert's stepmother about the move into the center of town from the schoolhouse, but I rather disbelieve that. I think old man Schubert would have been very angry indeed. Nevertheless, to move into Vienna, to be surrounded by his friends, to no longer have to teach, even if it meant a terrible, terrible argument with his father, this is what Schubert needed to do. At about this time, there's a comical story. Schubert was concerned to get Erlkönig published, even if Goethe wasn't interested in it. And he sent it to a firm in Leipzig, Breitkopf and Härtel. They were not interested in it, and it's quite interesting. Neither was Diabelli, the great Viennese publisher, interested in it. It was too new, too difficult. It was, well, they simply didn't have the understanding to see what a great piece of music it was. They sent it back, but unfortunately they sent it back to the only person who they sort of semi-knew, called Franz Schubert, who was a rather lackluster musician who lived in Dresden. But Franz Schubert of Dresden did make himself immortal by writing an enraged letter to Breitkopf and Härtel in Leipzig saying, "How dare you even have assumed that I was anything to do with rubbishy music like this?" Once again, Spaun plays a beneficial role. Even if he couldn't get Schubert's music published immediately, he could ensure that there was someone to sing it. In fact, the singer Johann Michael Vogl was the obvious choice. Vogl had retired from the opera, and Schubert had seen the great singer as Orestes in the Iphigenia operas of Gluck. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Vogl would be interested in performing Schubert's music? And there were various backstage machinations to make this come about. Vogl was not at all interested in a young composer, but eventually was wooed to meet Schubert, and there was a great big pile of music on the piano, and in a very disdainful manner, he started reading through the music. He was a very good sight reader. One can imagine his lorgnette. And bit by bit, he was absolutely amazed. Of course he was. His words were not all that encouraging. Nicht übel, not so bad. But in the end, he told Schubert that, yes, you should make more of yourself. You should have, in a sense, more self-esteem. You should push yourself better. This music is far better than your general demeanor seems to suggest to me. And so it came about that almost to his complete surprise, one of the great Austrian singers became attached to Schubert, amazed by Schubert, loyal to Schubert, at the same time as never being able to match Schubert's own retiring personality with the grandeur and the amazement of the music that was being composed. Mayrhofer was an opera goer and an admirer, and Schubert and the poet put their heads together to write music of a classical vein that Vogl would approve of. Vogl was called rara avis, rare bird, because of his knowledge of the classics, Latin and Greek, and he also actually knew English very well. And this is one of the songs that Vogl must have been delighted with. Fahrt zum Hades, Mayrhofer poem and imagining a journey, a terrified journey into Hades. And the singer here is Stephen Varco. Later in the year, Schubert composed a Schiller setting with a classical theme that actually also derives from Dante's Inferno. And it envisages, just like Fahrt zum Hades, a descent into the underworld. Schubert reuses certain musical figures that he'd actually invented for the descent into the maelstrom, the diver in the song Der Taucher that we looked at last time. This is an extraordinary song. I can't imagine what Vogl would have made of it. It seems to encapsulate the groaning, the misery, the drama of being consigned to hell. The singer here is Thomas Hampson. That was the beginning of the song. Now we're going to hear the exciting peroration, which builds up almost in a Rossini-like way, with modulations and one harmony and one thought capping the next, as the tortured souls ask, how long is this going to last? How long can this be bearable? How long will we endure this horror? And then, in a mighty gesture, breaking the scythe of time, the answer is from Jupiter: forever. Forever, you are consigned here, forever.
Fragen sich einander ängstlich leise, ob noch nicht Vollendung sei. Fragen sich einander ängstlich leise, ob noch nicht Vollendung sei, ob noch nicht Vollendung sei, ob noch nicht Vollendung sei. Ewigkeit schwingt über ihnen Kreise, bricht die Sense des Saturns entzwei. Ewigkeit schwingt über ihnen Kreise, bricht die Sense des Saturns entzwei. Bricht die Sense des Saturns entzwei.
Here are some of the other classic miracles from 1817 that were a result of the collaboration of Schubert and Mayrhofer. There's a beautiful poem, Memnon, which talks of a king. Of course, this is a mythological subject, and one can see a statue of Memnon still in Luxor, near the Valley of the Kings. But that statue was said to encase a live spirit who came to life at dawn and uttered a note. And Mayrhofer tends to retranslate the classics, to see another viewpoint of the classics, so that King Memnon is encased in a covering, a disguise, a being that has nothing to do with whom he really is. It's a question of suppression and a question of discipline. And the music comes to life as the song progresses, as the sunlight comes, and he's allowed to be himself, allowed his voice. But what Schubert achieves by setting the tone of the majesty of the statue, this huge statue, the hollowness of it, the knocking within the walls of the statue by the staccato notes within the chords. Somehow or other, and only rare genius can do this, he sets the mood without fail. The statue is grounded in one place, and from that music we hear that he can't move from his position, but would love to do so, dreams of doing so, dreams of not being imprisoned in this casing in which he is doomed to live. The sheer lyricism, the sheer amount of human understanding, the sheer mastery on a musical level is one thing, but on a psychological and human level, to receive from Schubert this wisdom that seems to emanate from his music so effortlessly, song after song, observation after observation, one thing after another, truly and profoundly understood. The peroration of Memnon has one of the most beautiful phrases, so beautiful, in fact, that the composer actually repeats it so that the singer can sing it slightly differently the second time. The liquidity of that, the dreaming of release. We only have to turn a few pages of the book and we discover another classical subject, Ganymed, the shepherd boy or the Trojan prince seduced by Zeus and taken up to the heavens, and in a way superbly reinterpreted by Goethe, who doesn't so much tell the story in mythological terms as reimagines himself. And it's this, I think, that Mayrhofer must have admired in recommending this poem to Schubert, reimagines himself as a young man so in love with the forces of nature that, like a Ganymed, he would yield to nature itself, allow himself to be seduced, surrounded, elevated, taken away, just like in the myths. But if Hugo Wolf's setting is steamier and more erotic, and Schubert's has been criticized on occasion for not matching up to that level of eroticism, we should understand that the purity of the music and the excitement and the youth of a person who feels for the first time at one with nature are perhaps nearer what Goethe actually meant in terms of what he wrote in his poem. And dealing with God and the presence of God and invoking the presence of God or the gods brings out in Schubert an unbelievable enthusiasm for one of those composers who's never given enough credit for his importance in Schubert's life, and that's Christoph Willibald von Gluck and his Iphigenia operas. Listen to this accompaniment like no other in any Schubert song, which actually is like that wonderful, pulsating, repetitive harmony that we get in Gluck operas when the Godhead approaches, and it's exactly the approach of the God in the Schubert Ganymed as well. And I'm only going to play you the accompaniment because it's the accompaniment that shows the Gluckian side of it. And here, the languishing of the stricken beloved, so enraptured by God all in all the manifestations of God and nature, that there is an element of eroticism. Lieg ich und schmachte. In diesen Armen, diesem Busen lieg ich und schmachte. The sensuality of the music at the same time as its essential high-minded purity, so that this is not an excuse to lead us into a world of sexual adventure via Ganymed, is something I believe that Mayrhofer would have exactly approved and been very much aware of in terms of his own ethic. The last classically inspired work of April 1817, the collaboration between Schubert and Mayrhofer, is the seldom performed extended ballad named Uraniens Flucht, the curse of Urania. The goddess Urania, who appears in Plato's Symposium as the goddess of same-sex love, returns in Mayrhofer's version of the poem, she returns bedraggled to Olympus, visibly shattered and shaken by the depredations of mankind, and particularly the crude sensuality of lustful men. Zeus is outraged on her behalf. All the festivities that are wonderfully described by Schubert at the beginning of the ballad are stopped, and he is determined to destroy Earth until in the distance from above, Urania and her father see two votaries so unlike the lustful men who have badly treated her, going to make an offering at her shrine. And Zeus spares the world. This is Mayrhofer's subtle reversal of the biblical story of the destruction of Sodom. The world is saved, not destroyed, on account of the love between men, albeit love of a very high-minded Platonic variety. We have fragments of a diary that Schubert wrote in 1816. It's a pity we don't have entries from other years and more diaries, and probably these don't exist. But some of the statements in these 1816 diaries seem to have come directly from Mayrhofer. Take people as they are, not as they should be. Happy is he who finds a true man friend. To a free man, matrimony is a terrifying thought in these days. The man exchanges freedom for either melancholy or crude sensuality. Well, these idées reçues are clearly things that Schubert and Mayrhofer have talked about. But one thing is certain, that Mayrhofer was no apologist for crude sensuality. Perhaps he would have been a happier and more released man if he were. The Catholicism he'd embraced in his youth had been replaced by the equally strict ideals of Platonism. Remember that in the Symposium, Socrates refuses the amatory advances of Alcibiades simply because he loves him too much. His love is on an altogether higher plane. I am certain that for Mayrhofer, Schubert was not a lover. There are some people who have proposed this as a possibility. I think it impossible. But what I do think is that two people found themselves together, like-minded for very different reasons and having very different personalities. Above all, Schubert was a project. Mayrhofer had always been interested in training young men as an educationalist so that they were fine and good individuals, manly individuals. But it has to be said that womankind and women didn't play a large part in this almost Spartan envisagement of a young person's life. Schubert did absorb, like blotting paper, what Mayrhofer had to teach him in terms of literature and aesthetics, other things. And Vogl was also a very, very important older man in terms of an educative influence. But it seems to me that the rarefied atmosphere of homoeroticism in some of the Mayrhofer texts and songs is as strictly controlled as a museum tour of classical sculpture. And it conceals a minefield of enraptured circumlocution and physical repression. I think that's how Mayrhofer lived his life and came to terms with what he was. And what he was that thing that did not exist in factual definition in 1820, a gay man. The costs of this suppressed life for the poet, well, he kept his dignity, I think, and I think he kept his sense of pride. But the costs were enormous. He committed suicide eventually 10 years after Schubert's death. And for a while, it seemed that for different reasons and for different angles, poet and composer suffered together. And one thing seems absolutely certain. They both shared an admiration for the good-looking, the charming, the extremely articulate, the extremely hospitable Franz von Schober, brought up by very liberal parents in Sweden and having none of the natural repressions of the Viennese as part of his amatory repertoire. He was a man of no deep talent, unfortunately, but he was a man who could make people fall for him, and he did so for almost his entire life. Of course, it was at this time that Schubert was living under Schober's roof with the family, and he wrote a song to a Schober text, a poem that the great poet Rilke, 75 years later, dubbed absolute trash, ghastly and sentimental. It's a poem that's loved, actually, by all Schubert lovers because of the music attached to it and the general sentiment of a love of music. But Schubert expresses his love of music in every song that he writes. He doesn't need Schober's text to release a song about music. But he needed the text as Schober wrote it to release music which seems to me as much a hymn to the poet as to music itself. Although it's clearly a hit tune, the composer kept it private, and he only published it in the second last year of his life. But what a tune it is. That sounds like something of a love song to me. In August 1817, Schubert's idyll with the Schobers was over. Simply because Axel Schober, Franz von Schober's brother, was ill. Schober had to leave Vienna to bring Axel back, who would use Schubert's bedroom in the Schober house for his convalescence. There was nothing for it for Schubert to go back once again to the schoolhouse, but not before he wrote a poem. The composer wrote a poem. Actually, he wrote quite a number of poems, but in his maturity, he only set one poem to music. He only did this once in his life, and it's a farewell song to Schober, who is leaving Vienna. The singer is Edith Matisse. The poem continues after that verse, and it has 4 verses altogether, and it says, "Hear in this mournful song the yearning of my inmost heart. If this song should stir your heart, my spirit will hover close by." There is no other human being, at least that we know of, for whom Schubert wrote words such as these. And there are a number of letters that we have where there are paragraphs of affection which seem unlike anything else that Schubert writes to other people. The man was to be a librettist, but not a successful one. The man was to actually contribute other poems. He was to vanish when it suited him from Schubert's life, when Schubert perhaps needed him most, when the composer was ill, but that's for a future year. In the meantime, we may observe that great love is very often given to those people who don't always deserve it. But then love has never been something about deserving in any case. With the Schober family no longer able to play the wonderful role of Schubert's hosts, he had to go home. By 1818, Franz Schubert Sr. had acquired a new schoolhouse in the Rossau, and the composer's help was once again enlisted, demanded, insisted upon. Schubert had a few compensations in 1818. He saw for the first time one of his songs in print. It was a beautiful song, a Mayrhofer setting, as a matter of fact, and Mayrhofer had quite a good deal to do with the publication, the song Erlafsee. And Erlafsee appeared as a supplement in an annual. A number of Schubert songs were to appear published as supplements to various Viennese publications. But there was another chance to get away. Between July and November, Schubert took a job at the Hungarian estate Zelitz, which was the country retreat of a branch of the all-powerful Esterházy family. And this particular Esterházy prince had 2 daughters, countesses, who were extremely musical. And it was considered necessary to have a live-in music teacher. Schubert was one of the members of staff. Indeed, He ate in the staff canteen and had staff quarters. The girls at that stage were still fairly young, and he had a lot of leisure time left to compose. So although he was far from home, at least he wasn't in the schoolhouse. He wrote affectionate letters to his friends, and he told them that he was composing like a god. What he was composing is very interesting. And to talk about the big song cantata Einsamkeit, one would have to go back to 1816 when Schubert had had a rather unpleasant surprise. Ludwig van Beethoven, that great master of music generally, had thankfully remained dormant only in one area, Lieder. And this had somehow in 1815 and 1816 made Schubert feel more enabled, that it gave him a greater freedom, that Beethoven's music wasn't breathing down his neck. Beethoven hadn't composed songs really since 1809. And right in the middle of this holiday where Schubert felt that, well, he couldn't write symphonies like Beethoven or string quartets or piano sonatas, but song was his special province. What happened but Beethoven, out of the blue, wrote, composed and published a very important song cycle called An die ferne Geliebte. This was a piece of music in 6 sections, one musical section going on to the next, about a man in different moods musing about the absence of the beloved. And it is a masterpiece. Trust Beethoven to just suddenly come up with a masterpiece, depressing and amazing and inspiring, all in one go. That Beethoven had managed to make songs bigger than the sum of their parts. You see, the trouble with being a great song composer is that each of the forms is so little, each item is so little. How does one actually make it add up to something bigger? The song cycle. And 1818 shows Schubert's search for cycle beginning. Thanks to Mayrhofer, they put their heads together, as I think they often did, and they came up with a long poem, almost a life's journey, a young man's journey through various stages of his life, starting in solitude, Einsamkeit, and ending thus. And in between, yes, parties, warfare, love, all the things that can happen in life, and coming full circle to Einsamkeit. The excitements of the big city, actually it's the only song in all Schubert that actually mentions shoppers and shopping. And it was Schubert's first attempt to give greater weight to his Lieder, and he was very pleased with the piece, although it took years and years after he died for it ever to be published. It represented a very important step forward for him, and he was to continue to look for ways whereby his songs could be bound together in groups in a cycle, achieving a significance thereby that a single slender song might not have on its own. After those months spent in the Hungarian countryside at Zelic, the thought of going back to live under his father's roof and in servitude was clearly something that Schubert wanted to avoid at all costs. And Mayrhofer agreed that Schubert could share his very simple and small lodgings. He rented a room from a Frau Sans Souci in the Wipplingerstrasse. Years later, the poet wrote, "The ceiling was somewhat sunk, the daylight reduced by a large building opposite, a played-out piano, a narrow bookshelf, such was the room. But the hours spent in it will never be erased from my memory." (1819) was the apex of the Mayrhofer years, not because there were more songs of Mayrhofer composed in 1819 than in 1817, they weren't, but because what does one term Mayrhofer songs? The poetry only, or the ideas and the poetry that Schubert set as a result of the friendship? I'm absolutely certain that in those days, before there was a great amount of entertainment, yes, they could sometimes go to the opera if they had the money, to the theater certainly, but they read to each other in the candlelight. The poetry of Friedrich von Schlegel, and in particular his Abendröte poems, which provide a sort of a metaphysical vision of nature, nature given voice to speak in terms expressing pantheism. Schubert wrote a set of these Schlegel songs, the Abendröte songs, and they are extraordinary, they're experimental. The 1819 to 20 period in Schubert's life is indeed very experimental, both in terms of musical solutions and in terms of the poetry that he said. Here is a song called Die Gebüsche, which is one of the most beautiful and strange of the Schlegel settings, and the singer is Matthias Görner. The continual harmonic changes for every beat of the bar are as dizzying and subtle as anything that one may find, for example, in the music of Gabriel Fauré. But there is a wonderful bel canto thread going through this music, which is also the theme of Schlegel's poem. By the way, also the poem placed at the head of Robert Schumann's Fantasy in C major years later. Through all the sounds in the earth's many colored dreams, one faint sound echoes for those who secretly listen. This is music for those who understand, for the elite, for the initiates, for those who perhaps express their love in secret, for those, certainly, who oppose the repressive regime of Metternich. In Schumannian terms, this is David against the Philistines. Music for the insiders. And with a classical twist, you could call it the sacred band of themes. Another important German poet who enters Schubert's life, almost certainly thanks to Mayrhofer, is Friedrich von Hardenberg, who was known as Novalis. He's one of the few poets who actually has fascinated the modern world. Penelope Fitzgerald's novel, The Blue Flower, all about Novalis, shows that there is something fascinating about his metaphysical writing and about his life that is very present day. Novalis allowed the erotic into his work as something sublime. This was a very, very good Mayrhofer type of compromise. Here is the Geistliches Lied, the sacred song that is also known as Maria. It's a single page of enormous restraint and beauty, and the singer here is Mary McLaughlin. There was a pleasant interlude of almost 3 months in the summer of 1819 when Schubert was invited by the baritone Vogl to visit Steyr in Upper Austria. It was his hometown, as it was also the hometown of Joseph von Spaun. Those who know Vienna will know that the summer heat of that city makes it highly desirable to get up and out into the mountains. And there were wonderful excursions into the countryside, as there always are in Schubertian holidays, this being really the first of a sequence of them. And Schubert littered music along the way, never ever taking time off from composing. It was as natural to him as breathing. The famous Trout Quintet was composed in this summer for friends in that part of the world. Here are 3 further songs from 1819. They're all part of the Schubert repertoire, but we pianists who work with these songs all the time have a way of finding wonderful new details in them. A great song from 1819 is Prometheus, the story of Prometheus, as he shakes his fist at Zeus and insists that he is capable of making the men as a potter in his own image and doesn't require divine intervention. By the way, we can also see that Prometheus, with the poem by Goethe, is another anti-father song. Everything I am, says Prometheus, is because I've worked for it, not because you deign to be my master as my father. But one can play songs like this and never realize, or at least it takes a lifetime to realize what details are taking place. In the last outburst of Prometheus, he says, "Here I'm sitting, making men in my own image, a race that will be like me to suffer and to weep, to enjoy and to celebrate, and not to venerate you." There are wonderful chords in the accompaniment. It may take an operatic composer like Benjamin Britten to envisage, and I think Schubert had the same kind of brain in terms of word-music relationships as Britten did, to envisage what's happening. Clay being thrown, the potter wheel spinning, men made in quick succession, made and the next bit of clay thrown, the activity, not the pompous chords that I've just shown you, but more like this. The imperious element of the spinning potter's wheel. Actually, I mentioned Britten because hearing him perform the song, I heard that phrasing. And it's an operatic ability to see pictures and translate them into sound that I think is exceptional here. The way that we actually feel the impetus of that spinning wheel and the clay thrown. Another wonderful song, absolutely different in terms of mood, is Die Götter Griechenlands. It's a Schiller setting, and very much Mayrhofer influence because it selects a single strophe from a very long poem by Schiller called Die Götter Griechenlands, the gods of Greece. The haunting refrain in A minor, all based on second inversion, 6/4 chords, inhabits an ethereal world that has been entirely lost in the present age, or at least in Schubert's present age, the longing for the beauties of Greek civilization, all that it represented, everything that it had become besmirched in the modern age, a longing for that to reestablish itself. And the change from A minor to A major, always a crucial change in Schubert, is so eloquent. And then, because Schubert lived in Vienna, where there were lots of Greek exiles, where there were lots of Greek tavernas, when he talks about the difference between ancient Greece with those classical columns of sound, with that extreme Parthenon-like dignity in that music, we get something that resembles the circus, the circular dance. How on earth could the song, if that were not the case, suddenly break into this type of music? It's only a passing moment, but it shows a vivid engagement not only with the past, but the real world we are living in, being able to unite them, bring them together, to tell us something about the past and the present, and miraculously all through it to have this heart, this understanding, this depth of perception, so that everything that is composed seems to come fresh off the page, even if it's a pastiche, even if there's time shifting involved, even if it's a homage to a different type of past. One of the most famous of the Mayrhofer settings is Nachtstück. It's very often performed in recitals, and it's a story of an aged minstrel whose time has come to die and who accepts death. It's very Mayrhofer-like, who was often thinking of bringing his own life to a close. But because he is in the woods and the forests, the whole of this music seems to owe something to Ossian. And the introduction, something like the chaos opening of the creation of Haydn. This is music for the ancients, music for Stonehenge, music that is slow and amazing and strange and wonderful, not of this time. And the time shift is deliberate. We're transported into another time, into another world, all through the incredible imagination. He can take us into a druidic forest, he can take us into a Greek temple, he can take us into the world of mythology, and he can take us into a farmyard, field, or a Viennese salon. It's all there at his fingertips. Mayrhofer was a very complicated man, and it must have been hell attempting to live and work in that room, considering that Schubert had so much instrumentation, orchestration of operas and so on. It's an amazement that he achieved what he did. He worked in the daylight hours when Mayrhofer was at the office. One of the most exceptional works of 1820 is an oratorio called Lazarus, a biblical oratorio of such refinement and such extraordinary word setting that it reminds us that Richard Wagner was already waiting in the wings for his time to come, but that certain things in Schubert's imagination in terms of using text and using harmony are, in a sense, there already before Wagner comes along to utilize what's already present in the musical atmosphere. In March 1820, one of the most unpleasant episodes in Schubert's life occurred. He was with his friend Johann Zen, a poet who came from the Tyrol, who was an extremely admired person by the group. He was a man of integrity, he was a man of imagination, he was a man of vigor, and he was a man of strong political opinions. cheeky. And the police swooped on the meeting that Schubert and some friends were having at Zen's house. And they were taken in for questioning. One can only imagine what Schubert Sr. thought about this when news reached him. Fortunately, Schubert got away with a warning. He kept his head beneath the parapet. It must have been very frightening, because the agents of Metternich were extraordinarily malign in terms of imagining enemies around every corner. And what they really disliked about Johann Zen was that he was clever, that he was amusing, that he provided witty answers in his interview. And they feared insurrection from students and from young people. As a result, Zen was banished to the Tyrol. He couldn't live in Vienna as an artist. It was just as bad, perhaps, as keeping him in the cell to which he was first confined for 2 months. But it was artistic death for him, and the rest of his life reads as a tragedy. So Schubert got off lightly, not considered important enough, articulate enough, dangerous enough for the police to bother with. All through his life, Schubert was composing operas in the hope of there being performances, in the hope of establishing his fame, but also because his musical mind was broad enough and big enough to think in those kind of structures. And his song composing definitely benefits from the fact that he is no mere miniaturist when it comes to his musical imagination. In 1820, he actually heard an opera of his in the Kärntner Theatre, on the stage, 6 performances. It was called Die Zwillingsbrüder, and it was an opera written to flatter Vogl, the singer, in the last legs of his career by now. He was given a double role as twins. So it was the twin brothers, and Schubert was present. And it said that he refused to take a curtain call at the end of the show. As ever, he felt himself unworthy of that kind of acknowledgement and celebration. And at the same time as composing operas and other works, amazingly, there were more settings of Novalis, a single Ulan song, Frühlingsglaube, and further settings of Schlegel. As for the Schlegel songs, no song is more exciting among these than Im Walde, otherwise known as Waldesnacht. The singer is Matthias Görner.
Das Rauschen Gottes Flügel, tief in kühler Waldesnacht, in das Rauschen Gottes Flügel, tief in kühler Waldesnacht.
Who, on listening to that music, would imagine that as coming from 1820? The harmonic shifts, the daring, and of course this lack of concern. If the poem is long and requires length, let the length be heavenly length, as Schumann later remarked about the space that Schubert's compositions take up. Notwithstanding great songs like that, and great poets, and the fact that this is a Schlegel setting, the whole of this period really belongs to Mayrhofer as an influence, as a mentor, with Schubert actually living under his roof and preferring to live under his roof, as difficult as he was, as demanding as he was, as uptight as he was in many respects, preferring to live under his roof than live with his father and work as a teacher. He received daily encouragement and validation from Mayrhofer that he'd never received from home. And yet, well, this arrangement of living in a single room could not last. There were too many tensions. Mayrhofer was a difficult and moody man who was probably quick to express his disapproval of any sign that his protege, this creature that he'd created in terms of this genius that he'd fostered, if there was any sign of unworthy behavior that was not on the poet's syllabus of forming the perfect artist. And yes, sexual behavior was almost certainly an area where there were repressions of the poet, and the diffidence and the inexperience and the lack of confidence of the composer. Well, these two things were convenient for a time for these two men to live together. They were both holding back from the real world out there in sensual Vienna. They were holding back for entirely different reasons. But this could not remain the case permanently. And so there was a break, a kind of leaving home for the second time. A different kind of father figure, a father figure in a way perhaps just as exacting. But Schubert had had enough. We don't know if there was any acrimony. They seem to have had contact, but certainly the contract was different between them. Certainly, as we know, Schubert some years later returned to the poet and set more poetry. He seemed to have genuinely admired the work. It was the man that was the problem. He moved out and found his own apartment, albeit on the same street, the Wipplingerstrasse. So with 47 Mayrhofer settings, that's all in all, including the songs from 1824, this poet was second only to Goethe in terms of the number of texts provided for this great composer to set to music. We end today with one of the grandest and noblest of the Mayrhofer settings, Freiwilliges Versinken of 1820. The setting of the sun as the moon rises is depicted in quasi-Baroque terms as a kind of royal progress, a mixture of recitative, arioso, and sublime melody. It's a fitting song to end because Mayrhofer has traversed the Schubertian firmament with the grandeur and dignity of a man altruistically devoted to the best in art. Lovers of Schubert's music have a lot to thank him for.
Oh, hey. Tod